Picture this. You're standing at the altar on what should be the happiest day of your life when your own mother leans over and whispers the words that could shatter everything. "He'll leave you soon, Cassandra. Mark my words." But what happened next would silence her forever and change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the power of truly knowing someone. This is my story. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of my wedding started like something out of a fairy tale. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the bridal suite at the Rosewood Manor in Asheville, North Carolina, casting everything in a golden glow that made the silk of my dress shimmer like liquid moonlight. My bridesmaids bustled around me, adjusting my veil, touching up my makeup, their laughter filling the room with the kind of joy that only comes with momentous occasions. But there was one person conspicuously absent from all the preparation and excitement. My mother, Eleanor Whitman, sat in the corner of the room like a storm cloud on an otherwise perfect day. While everyone else radiated happiness, she wore the expression of someone attending a funeral rather than her daughter's wedding. "Cassie, honey, you look absolutely radiant," my maid of honor, Jessica Martinez, said as she stepped back to admire the final touches on my appearance. The dress was everything I had dreamed of. A vintage-inspired A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves and tiny pearl buttons that ran down the length of my spine. It had belonged to my grandmother on my father's side, altered to fit me perfectly. "Thank you, Jess. I can't believe this day is finally here." I turned to catch my reflection in the full-length mirror, and for a moment, I hardly recognized myself. The woman looking back at me seemed older, more confident, glowing with a happiness that came from somewhere deep inside. My other bridesmaids, my college roommate Sarah Chen and my cousin Rebecca Torres, gathered around, each offering their own compliments and well wishes. The energy in the room should have been infectious, should have swept away any lingering doubts or concerns. But my mother's presence cast a shadow that seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. Eleanor had never been what you'd call supportive of my relationship with Marcus Sullivan. From the very beginning, she'd found fault with everything about him. He was too young, too ambitious, too focused on his career as a software engineer. He came from a family she deemed unsuitable. His parents were hardworking middle-class people who owned a small bakery in downtown Portland, Oregon. To my mother, who had married my father for his established law practice and social connections, Marcus represented everything she had tried to escape from her own humble beginnings. The irony wasn't lost on me that my mother, who had grown up in a trailer park in rural Mississippi before reinventing herself as a society wife, had become the very type of person who would have looked down on herself. Success and money had changed her, hardened her in ways that made her judge others, by standards she herself had never originally met. "Cassandra," my mother's voice cut through the cheerful chatter like a knife through silk. "I need to speak with you privately." The room fell silent. Jessica caught my eye in the mirror, her expression questioning. I could see the concern in her face, the way she glanced between my mother and me as if sensing the tension that had been building for months. "Mom, can it wait? The ceremony starts in less than an hour." I tried to keep my voice light, hoping to preserve the magical atmosphere that had taken so much effort to create. "No, it cannot wait." Eleanor stood up from her chair, smoothing down her navy blue mother-of-the-bride dress that she'd chosen specifically because it was understated, her way of showing disapproval without causing a scene. "Ladies, would you mind giving us a moment?" My bridesmaids exchanged glances before reluctantly filing out of the room. Jessica squeezed my shoulder as she passed, whispering, "We'll be right outside if you need us." Once we were alone, the silence stretched between my mother and me like a chasm. She walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where guests were already beginning to take their seats. The late afternoon sun caught the silver threads in her carefully styled hair, highlighting the tension in her shoulders. You're making a mistake, Cassandra. Her words were delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to cut deep and clean. Mom, please. Not today. I could feel my carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life. She turned from the window, her blue eyes, so much like my own, filled with what she probably thought was maternal concern, but looked more like condescension. That's exactly why I have to say this now, before it's too late. Too late for what? To save you from the heartbreak that's coming. She moved closer, her voice dropping to the tone she used when she wanted to sound authoritative. I've been watching Marcus these past 2 years, studying him. He's not the man you think he is. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I felt my chest tighten, not because I believed her, but because I couldn't understand how my own mother could be so determined to poison what should have been a perfect day. What are you talking about? I managed to ask, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. He's using you, sweetheart. Can't you see that? You have your trust fund from your grandfather, your connections, your father's influence in the legal community. Marcus sees you as a ticket to a better life. She reached out as if to touch my face, but I stepped back instinctively. That's not true. Marcus has never asked me for anything. He's never even wanted me to help him with his business. Of course he hasn't asked directly. He's smarter than that. But mark my words, Cassandra. Once that ring is on your finger and the paperwork is signed, you'll see his true colors. Men like him, they're very good at playing the long game. The cruelty of her words was breathtaking. Here I was, 30 minutes before walking down the aisle to marry the man I loved more than anything in the world, and my own mother was trying to convince me that our entire relationship was built on deception and greed. Why are you doing this? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Because I love you. Because I've been where you are. And I know how these things end. Her voice softened slightly, but the venom was still there underneath. Your father was different when we were dating too. Attentive, romantic, devoted. But once we were married, once he knew I wasn't going anywhere, everything changed. Marcus is not Dad. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was beginning to feel desperate. And even if Dad changed, that doesn't mean every man will. Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, my naive little girl. You think love conquers all, don't you? You think that just because you feel butterflies when he kisses you, just because he remembers how you like your coffee, that means he'll be faithful and devoted forever? Yes, I do think that. Because I know Marcus. I know his heart. You know what he's shown you. There's a difference. She moved to the dressing table, picking up one of my earrings and examining it as if it were evidence in a case she was building. Let me ask you something, Cassandra. What do you really know about his finances, his debts, his business dealings, the deal? Question caught me off guard, not because it revealed some hidden truth, but because it showed how little my mother understood about trust and partnership. I know enough. We've talked about our future, our goals, our plans. But have you seen his bank statements, his credit report? Do you know exactly how much money his little software company is making or losing? I don't need to see those things. That's not how relationships work. That's exactly how marriages work, sweetheart. Money is the root of most divorces, and when a man with nothing marries a woman with everything, well... She let the sentence hang unfinished, the implication clear. I felt something shift inside me then, a steel door slamming shut against her words. You're wrong about him. You're wrong about us. And you're wrong about love. Am I? She set down the earring and turned to face me fully. Then tell me this. If Marcus loves you so much, why hasn't he insisted on a prenuptial agreement? Any man with honorable intentions would want to protect both of you. The question hit like a physical blow, because she was right about one thing. How we hadn't signed a prenup, but it wasn't because Marcus was scheming to take my money. It was because we had decided together that we didn't want to start our marriage planning for its failure. We discussed it and decided against it. Together. Because we trust each other. How convenient for him. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm sure he was very persuasive in those discussions. A knock on the door interrupted what was becoming an increasingly ugly conversation. Cassie? Jessica's voice came through the wood. It's time. My heart began to race, but not with the excitement I had expected. Instead, I felt a sick churning in my stomach, as if my mother's poison was beginning to work its way through my system despite my best efforts to resist it. I have to go, I said, moving toward the door. Cassandra, wait. My mother's voice stopped me with my hand on the doorknob. I want you to remember this conversation. When things start to fall apart, and they will, remember that someone who loves you tried to warn you. I turned back to look at her one last time before opening the door. The only thing I'll remember is that my mother tried to ruin the most important day of my life. But as I stepped out into the hallway where my bridesmaids waited with encouraging smiles and last-minute adjustments, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The confidence I had felt just minutes earlier seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that I couldn't quite push away. The music had already started. Somewhere beyond these walls, Marcus was waiting for me at the altar, probably checking his watch and wondering if I was getting cold feet. Our guests were seated, our families gathered, the minister ready to perform the ceremony we had planned for over a year. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But my mother's words echoed in my mind like a curse, planting seeds of doubt that I desperately didn't want to take root. What if she was right? What if I had been blind to signs that everyone else could see? What if Marcus really was too good to be true? The walk down the aisle felt like moving through water. Each step seemed to take forever, yet somehow I was approaching the altar too quickly. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon, just as we had rehearsed, but the familiar melody sounded distant and distorted, as if I were hearing it from underwater. 200 guests rose to their feet as I appeared in the doorway of the chapel. I could see familiar faces turn toward me. My college professors, Marcus's co-workers from TechFlow Solutions, distant relatives who had traveled from across the country. They all wore the same expression of joy and anticipation, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside my chest. But it was Marcus who commanded my attention. He stood at the altar in his charcoal gray tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his green eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. When our gazes met, his face lit up with the kind of smile that had first made me fall in love with him 3 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. For a moment, seeing him there, my mother's words seemed ridiculous. This was Marcus Sullivan, the man who had stayed up all night with me when I had food poisoning, who had driven 4 hours to surprise me on my birthday when I was feeling lonely, who had learned to make my grandmother's apple pie recipe just because I mentioned missing it. How could this man, this beautiful, genuine soul, be the calculating opportunist my mother had described? My father, Judge William Whitman, walked beside me with practiced dignity. He had officiated at enough ceremonies to know the importance of proper pacing, of allowing each moment its due reverence. But I could feel the slight tremor in his arm as I held on to him, could sense his awareness that something wasn't quite right with his daughter. "You look pale, sweetheart," he whispered as we paused at the midway point of our procession. "Are you feeling all right?" I managed to smile and nodded, not trusting my voice. The last thing I wanted was for my father to sense the doubt that my mother had so skillfully planted. He had his own complicated relationship with Eleanor, and I knew that any sign of wedding day drama would send him into lawyer mode, looking for problems to solve and conflicts to mediate. As we reached the altar, Marcus stepped forward to receive me from my father. The handoff was smooth, practiced from our rehearsal the night before, but when Marcus took my hands in his, I felt him pause. His eyes searched my face with the intensity of someone who knew me well enough to read the subtle signs of distress. "Hey," he whispered, so quietly that only I could hear. "You okay?" I squeezed his hands and nodded again, forcing what I hoped was a convincing smile, but I could see in his expression that he wasn't entirely convinced. Marcus had always been perceptive, always able to sense my moods even when I tried to hide them. Reverend Patricia Holmes, the minister we had chosen after meeting with several candidates, began the ceremony with a warm welcome to our guests. She spoke about love and commitment, about the journey that had brought Marcus and me to this moment. Her words were beautiful and meaningful, exactly what we had hoped for, but I found myself struggling to focus on them. Instead, my eyes kept drifting to the front row where my mother sat next to my father's empty seat. Eleanor's face was a mask of polite attention, but I could see something calculating behind her eyes, as if she were waiting for something to happen. She had dressed conservatively for the occasion, but there was something about her posture that suggested she wasn't planning to remain a passive observer for the entire ceremony. "Marriage is not just the joining of two hearts," Reverend Holmes continued, "but the blending of two lives, two histories, two futures into something greater than the sum of its parts. It requires trust, communication, and above all, the willingness to choose love even when it's difficult." Trust. The word hit me like a physical blow. How could I stand here promising to trust Marcus with my whole heart, when my mother's accusations were still echoing in my mind? What if there were things about him that I didn't know? What if the financial concerns she had raised were legitimate? Marcus must have felt me tense, because he squeezed my hands gently, his thumb stroking across my knuckles in the same soothing gesture he had used countless times during our relationship. The familiar touch should have been comforting, but instead, it made me wonder if even his gestures of affection were calculated, designed to manipulate my emotions. "Before we proceed with the vows," Reverend Holmes announced, "Marcus has asked if he might share something special with Cassandra and with all of you." This wasn't part of our rehearsal. I looked at Marcus in confusion, but he was already reaching into his jacket pocket, his face wearing an expression I had never seen before. Nervous but determined, like someone about to take a leap of faith. "Cassie," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel despite its slight tremor. "When I asked you to marry me, you said something that I've thought about every single day since. You said you wanted to build a life with me based on complete honesty and trust." My heart began to race. Was this it? Was this the moment when my mother's predictions would prove true? Was Marcus about to confess to some deception, some hidden agenda that would validate every doubt she had planted? He pulled an envelope from his pocket, thick and official-looking. "I've been keeping something from you, and I can't start our marriage with secrets between us." The chapel fell silent except for the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears. Hayar was dimly aware of the guests leaning forward in their seats, sensing that we had moved beyond the scripted elements of the ceremony into something unplanned and potentially explosive. 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator. Marcus's words seemed to echo off the stone walls of the chapel. Several guests gasped audibly, and I saw my mother straighten in her seat, her expression shifting from calculating to triumphant. "Marcus, what?" I started to speak, but he held up his hand gently. "Please let me finish. I need to say this." He looked down at the envelope in his hands, then back up at me. "I hired an investigator to look into my own background. Every debt, every financial record, every business transaction I've ever made. I wanted to make sure that when I married you, you would have absolute proof that I'm not with you for your money." The revelation hit me like a physical force. This wasn't a confession of wrongdoing. It was the exact opposite. Marcus had somehow anticipated my mother's accusations and had taken steps to disprove them before they could poison our marriage. "I know what people say about me," he continued, his voice growing stronger. That I'm marrying above my station, that I must have ulterior motives for wanting to be with someone from your family's background. I've heard the whispers at parties, seen the looks from some of your parents' friends. He turned slightly to address the congregation, but his words were clearly meant for one person in particular. I've heard people suggest that I'm using Cassie, that I see her as a meal ticket or a social climbing opportunity, and I realized that as long as those doubts existed, they could poison our happiness. Marcus turned back to me and held out the envelope. This contains a complete financial disclosure prepared by Morrison & Associates, one of the most respected accounting firms in the Pacific Northwest. Every asset, every debt, every source of income I have. It also includes a legally binding document renouncing any claim to your family's wealth, your trust fund, or any inheritance you might receive. My hands shook as I took the envelope from him. The weight of it felt significant, not just physically but symbolically. This wasn't just paperwork. It was proof of a level of consideration and foresight that I had never expected. But that's not all, Marcus said, reaching into his other pocket. I also had them prepare this. He produced a second envelope, this one even thicker than the first. This is a complete business plan for expanding my software company, including projected revenue, potential investors, and growth strategies. I wanted you to see that I have my own ambitions, my own plans for success that have nothing to do with your family's money. The chapel was so quiet I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats. Everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of vulnerability and transparency that went far beyond typical wedding day declarations. I'm also transferring 51% ownership of TechFlow Solutions to you as a wedding gift, Marcus continued. Not because I want you to support me, but because I want you to be my full partner in every aspect of our life together. If the company succeeds, we succeed together. If it fails, we face that together too. I stared at the envelopes in my hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Marcus was offering. This wasn't just transparency. It was a complete inversion of every accusation my mother had made. Instead of trying to access my wealth, he was offering to share his own future success with me. Marcus, you didn't have to, I began, but he shook his head. Yes, I did. Because I love you, Cassie. Not your trust fund, not your family connections, not what you can do for my career. I love the woman who stays up until 3 a.m. reading because she can't put down a good book. I love the woman who cries at insurance commercials and keeps an emergency chocolate stash in her desk drawer. I love the woman who believes in me even when I don't believe in myself. Tears were streaming down my face now, but they were tears of relief and joy, rather than the anxiety that had been building all morning. Looking at Marcus, seeing the sincerity in his eyes and the vulnerability in his expression, I realized how completely my mother's poison had been neutralized. I wanted our marriage to start with complete transparency, he said, taking my hands again. No secrets, no doubts, no questions about motives or intentions. Just two people who choose to love each other, build a life together, and face whatever comes with complete honesty. I became aware that many of our guests were crying now too, moved by the unexpected display of devotion and trust. But more importantly, I became aware of one person who was not crying, who was instead sitting rigid in her seat with an expression of shock and something that looked like defeat. My mother had not expected this, whatever scenario she had imagined. For this moment, it had not included Marcus voluntarily surrendering control of his business and providing documentary proof of his financial integrity. The calculating look in her eyes had been replaced by something else, the recognition that her carefully constructed narrative had just crumbled to dust. "Reverend Holmes," I said, finding my voice at last. "I think we're ready for the vows now." But before the minister could respond, I turned to face the congregation, still holding the envelopes that represented Marcus's extraordinary gesture of trust. I want everyone here to understand something, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel. What my husband just did, and yes, he's already my husband in every way that matters. What he just did is exactly why I fell in love with him, not because he's trying to prove anything to anyone else, but because he understood that starting our marriage with complete honesty was more important than protecting his pride or maintaining his privacy. I looked directly at my mother as I continued. There have been people who questioned Marcus's motives, who suggested that he was using me or manipulating me. I want those people to understand that they were wrong. Not just wrong about Marcus, but wrong about me. Wrong to assume that I'm naive enough to be fooled or weak enough to be manipulated. The silence in the chapel was profound. Even the sound of rustling fabric had stopped as everyone held their breath, waiting to see where this unexpected turn would lead. Marcus Sullivan is marrying me because he loves me, and I'm marrying him because he's the most honest, most genuine person I've ever known. The fact that he would go to these lengths to prove his integrity only confirms what I already knew about his character. I turned back to Marcus, who was watching me with an expression of pure love and admiration. Now, I said, smiling through my tears, I believe we have some vows to exchange. The vows that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Standing there with Marcus, holding those envelopes that represented his complete trust and transparency, the words we had written months earlier took on a deeper meaning. When he promised to love me in prosperity and in hardship, I knew he meant it literally. He had just handed me legal control of his future success. I, Cassandra Marie Whitman, take you, Marcus James Sullivan, to be my husband, I said, my voice steady now, despite the emotional whirlwind of the past hour. I promise to trust you completely, to support your dreams as you support mine, and to never let the opinions of others interfere with the love we've built together. The last part wasn't in our original vows. I had added it spontaneously, but I could see from Marcus's expression that he understood exactly who those words were meant for. When Reverend Holmes pronounced us husband and wife, the kiss we shared felt like a declaration of war against everyone who had doubted us. The chapel erupted in applause and cheers, but I was only dimly aware of the celebration around us. All that mattered was this moment, this man, and the future we would build together on a foundation of complete honesty. As we walked back down the aisle as Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, I caught a glimpse of my mother's face. The shock had faded, replaced by something harder and more calculating. Eleanor Whitman did not accept defeat gracefully, and I could already see her mind working, trying to find another angle of attack. The receiving line after the ceremony was a blur of congratulations and well wishes. Marcus's parents, Robert and Linda Sullivan, were practically glowing with pride and happiness. His father, a bear of a man with flour-dusted hands from a lifetime of baking, enveloped me in a hug that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. "Welcome to the family, daughter," he said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. The contrast between his acceptance and my mother's hostility was stark and painful. Marcus's sister, Diana Sullivan Chen, was equally welcoming. She had flown in from San Francisco with her husband and twin daughters, and I could see the family, resemblance in her kind eyes and easy smile. "That was the most romantic thing I've ever seen," she whispered as she hugged me. "Marcus has been planning that financial disclosure for months. He was so nervous about it, kept asking if it was too much, if it would embarrass you." The revelation that Marcus had been planning this gesture for months, that he had anticipated potential doubts about his motives and had taken steps to address them long before my mother's poison could take root, filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the late afternoon sun streaming through the chapel windows. But the warmth faded when I reached my own parents in the receiving line. My father, ever the diplomat, offered his congratulations with professional grace, but I could see the questions in his eyes. He had witnessed the entire financial disclosure scene, and while he seemed impressed by Marcus's gesture, I knew he was already thinking about the legal implications. My mother, however, was a different story entirely. When she reached me in the line, she leaned in close and whispered, "This doesn't change anything, Cassandra. If anything, it makes me more suspicious." "Mom, please. Not here. Not now." I tried to keep my voice low, aware that we were surrounded by guests who were watching our interaction with interest. "A guilty man protests too much," she continued, her smile never wavering for the benefit of our audience. "Why would an innocent person go to such elaborate lengths to prove their innocence? It's suspicious." The twisted logic was breathtaking. Marcus had provided exactly the kind of transparency she had claimed to want, and now she was using that very transparency as evidence of guilt. It was clear that no amount of proof would ever be enough to satisfy her predetermined narrative. "We'll discuss this later," I said firmly, moving on to the next guest before she could respond. The cocktail hour was held in the manor's garden, where white lights twinkled in the trees and servers moved smoothly, between guests offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Marcus and I mingled separately at first, as was traditional, each spending time with our respective families and friends. I found myself surrounded by my college friends, who were all eager to hear about the dramatic moment during the ceremony. Sarah Chen, my former roommate who was now a successful marketing executive in Chicago, pulled me aside near the rose garden. "Cassie, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Marcus basically just handed you his entire company as a wedding gift," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "I mean, I've dated guys who wouldn't even let me see their Netflix passwords." "I know. I'm still processing it all." I took a sip of champagne, hoping it would calm my nerves. I had no idea he was planning any of that. "Your mother looked like she'd been hit by a truck," Sarah observed with characteristic bluntness. I take it she wasn't expecting Marcus to be quite so forthcoming about his finances. Before I could answer, Jessica appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with excitement and champagne. "Cassie, everyone's talking about what happened there. It's like something out of a movie. And your mother—" She paused, glancing around to make sure Eleanor wasn't within earshot. "She's been holding court by the bar, telling anyone who'll listen that the whole thing is suspicious." My heart sank. I should have known that my mother wouldn't let Marcus's gesture speak for itself. Eleanor had always been skilled at spinning narratives to suit her purposes, and apparently she was already hard at work trying to undermine what should have been a moment of pure joy and validation. "What is she saying exactly?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "She's suggesting that Marcus only did the financial disclosure because he knew he was about to be caught in some kind of fraud," Jessica said, lowering her voice. "She's telling people that innocent men don't need to prove their innocence so dramatically." The champagne turned bitter in my mouth. It wasn't enough for my mother to disapprove of my choice in private. She was actively trying to poison other people's perception of my husband on our wedding day. "She's also been asking questions about the accounting firm that prepared the disclosure," Sarah added reluctantly, wondering aloud if Marcus might have somehow manipulated the documents or bribed them to hide something. I felt a surge of anger, so intense it made my hands shake. There was literally nothing Marcus could have done that would have satisfied my mother. If he had refused to provide financial information, she would have called him secretive. When he provided complete transparency, she called it suspicious. When he offered to share his business success with me, she suggested it was a cover-up for fraud. "I need to find Marcus," I said, setting down my champagne glass before I could throw it at something. I located him near the fountain, surrounded by his co-workers from TechFlow Solutions. They were all congratulating him not just on the marriage, but on what they clearly saw as an incredibly romantic and generous gesture. The contrast between their reaction and my mother's poisonous interpretation couldn't have been starker. "There's my wife," Marcus said when he saw me approaching, and the word wife sent a thrill through me despite everything else that was happening. He wrapped his arm around my waist and pulled me close, and for a moment, I let myself forget about my mother's campaign of character assassination. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, and I realized that he had probably been fielding his own set of questions and comments about the ceremony. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. What you did there, Marcus, it was beautiful and completely unnecessary, but beautiful." He smiled, but I could see the tension in his eyes. "It felt necessary to me. I never want there to be any doubt about why I'm with you." "There isn't any doubt. Not for me." I reached up to straighten his tie, a gesture that felt wonderfully domestic and permanent. "But my mother is apparently working overtime to create doubt in everyone else." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "What do you mean?" I glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then quickly filled him in on what Jessica and Sarah had told me. I watched his face cycle through emotions: disappointment, frustration, and finally, a kind of resigned determination. "I should have expected this," he said when I finished. "I should have realized that providing proof wouldn't be enough. She was never looking for evidence. She was looking for validation of a conclusion she'd already reached." "This isn't your fault, Marcus. You can't logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into." I had heard my father say that phrase many times in reference to difficult clients, but it had never felt more relevant than it did. Right now? Maybe not, but I can make it a lot harder for her to spread doubt. Marcus's voice had taken on a tone I recognized from his business dealings: calm, strategic, and absolutely determined. "Excuse me for just a minute." Before I could ask what he was planning, Marcus had stepped away from me and was walking purposefully toward the bar area where, sure enough, my mother was holding court with a group of wedding guests. I followed at a distance, close enough to hear but far enough away to avoid being drawn directly into whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Just seems very convenient timing, don't you think?" my mother was saying to Mrs. Patricia Henning, one of my father's law partner's wives, and Dr. Michael Rodriguez, our longtime family physician. "Why would someone go to such lengths unless they had something to hide?" "Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. The conversations around him stopped as people turned to see what was happening. "I believe you have some questions about the financial documents I presented today?" My mother's face went pale, then flushed red. She clearly hadn't expected Marcus to confront her directly, especially not in front of the other guests. "I was simply expressing concern for my daughter's welfare," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "Of course you were, and I respect that." Marcus's tone was polite, but firm, "which is why I'd like to address your concerns directly, rather than having them spread through speculation and innuendo." The garden had gone remarkably quiet. Guests who had been engaged in their own conversations were now clearly listening to the drama unfolding near the bar. "You've suggested that my financial disclosure was suspicious because innocent people don't need to prove their innocence. That's an interesting perspective." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Would you be satisfied if the accounting firm that prepared the documents confirmed their authenticity publicly? I can have David Morrison on the phone in 30 seconds. Eleanor's confident expression faltered slightly. David Morrison was one of the most respected accountants in the Pacific Northwest, a man whose reputation was beyond reproach. "You've also suggested that I might have manipulated the documents somehow. Would you like me to arrange for an independent audit by a firm of your choosing? I'm happy to pay for it, and we can have the results within a week." The offer was so reasonable, so transparent, that several of the guests murmured approvingly. My mother was clearly being backed into a corner, her accusations exposed as unfounded and malicious. "That won't be necessary," she said stiffly. "Are you sure?" "Because I want to be absolutely certain that there are no lingering doubts about my motives or my character." Marcus's voice remained perfectly calm, but there was steel underneath. "I love your daughter, Mrs. Whitman. I love her enough to marry her knowing that it would mean dealing with a mother-in-law who sees me as a threat rather than as someone who makes her daughter happy." The words hung in the garden air like a challenge. Several guests gasped softly at Marcus's directness, but no one seemed shocked by the sentiment. Eleanor's hostility had been obvious to everyone present. I love Cassie enough to spend thousands of dollars on private investigators and accountants just to prove that I'm not after her money, Marcus continued. I love her enough to transfer majority ownership of my company to her, knowing that it gives her complete control over my professional future. The question is, Mrs. Whitman, do you love your daughter enough to accept that she's made a good choice? The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the garden was focused on my mother, waiting to see how she would respond to this direct challenge. I found myself holding my breath, hoping against hope that maybe, finally, she would see reason. But when Eleanor finally spoke, her words crushed any hope I had harbored for reconciliation. Time will tell, Mr. Sullivan. Time will tell. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing by the bar with an expression of sad resignation, and leaving me to realize that my mother had just declared war on my marriage. On my wedding day. The reception dinner proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that no amount of elegant decor or excellent catering could mask. Marcus and I sat at the head table, flanked by our wedding party, trying to maintain the appearance of newlywed bliss, while the confrontation in the garden cast a shadow over what should have been pure celebration. The ballroom at Rosewood Manor was everything we had dreamed of when we booked the venue 8 months earlier. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white roses and eucalyptus, while soft jazz played from a quartet positioned near the dance floor. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, serving a menu we had carefully selected, after multiple tastings. Everything was perfect except for the family drama that seemed to permeate the very air we breathed. My father, seated to my left, leaned over during the salad course. Cassandra, we need to discuss what happened during cocktails, he said in the low, measured tone he used when discussing sensitive legal matters. Dad, please, can we get through? Dinner first? I stabbed at a piece of arugula with more force than necessary. Your mother crossed a line tonight. What Marcus did was admirable, but Eleanor's response was... He paused, searching for diplomatic language. Inappropriate for the occasion. Judge William Whitman was not a man given to emotional outbursts or dramatic pronouncements. For him to criticize my mother's behavior so directly meant that her conduct had been far worse than I had initially realized. How bad was it after I left to find Marcus? I asked, dreading the answer. My father's expression grew grimmer. She continued making insinuations about the authenticity of the documents. Several guests appeared uncomfortable with her persistence. Dr. Rodriguez actually walked away in the middle of her speculation about forensic accounting. The news hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Rodriguez had been our family physician for over 15 years, had delivered me as a baby, and had watched me grow up. If Eleanor's behavior had been extreme enough to drive away such a longtime family friend, then she had truly gone beyond the bounds of acceptable conduct. I'm sorry, Dad. I know this isn't how you wanted to spend your daughter's wedding day. He reached over and squeezed my hand gently. None of this is your fault, sweetheart. You and Marcus handled the situation with dignity and grace. I'm proud of you both. The conversation was interrupted by the clinking of glasses, signaling that it was time for the toasts. Marcus squeezed my other hand under the table as his best man, Tyler Brooks, rose from his seat with a champagne flute in hand. Tyler had been Marcus's roommate at Oregon State University and had remained his closest friend through the years. He was a software engineer at Intel, brilliant but socially awkward, and I had worried about how he would handle the pressure of giving a wedding toast. Good evening, everyone, Tyler began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. For those who don't know me, I'm Tyler Brooks, and I've had the dubious honor of being Marcus's best friend for the past 8 years. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. Maybe the rest of the evening would proceed normally, despite the earlier drama. I first met Marcus when he was a broke college student living on ramen noodles and sheer determination, Tyler continued. Even then, he had this incredible work ethic and this vision for creating software that would actually help people solve real problems. But more importantly, he had integrity. When other students were cutting corners or cheating on assignments, Marcus was staying up all night to do things the right way. I glanced at Marcus and saw him smiling at the memory. It was exactly the kind of character reference that made my mother's accusations seem even more absurd. When Marcus told me he had met someone special, I was skeptical, Tyler admitted. Not because I didn't think he deserved happiness, but because he had always been so focused on his career that I wasn't sure he knew how to balance work and relationships. But then I met Cassie, and I watched how Marcus changed around her. He became more relaxed, more confident, more himself. The toast continued with stories about Marcus's character, his loyalty as a friend, and his dedication to building something meaningful with his life. Tyler spoke about late-night coding sessions where Marcus would talk about his dreams not just for professional success, but for finding someone to share that success with. What I witnessed during the ceremony today was vintage Marcus Sullivan, Tyler concluded. When he saw that someone he loved might have doubts, he didn't get defensive or angry. He got transparent. He opened up every aspect of his life for examination because he knew that truth was more important than pride. That's the kind of man you want in your corner, and that's the kind of man Cassie is lucky enough to call her husband. The applause was enthusiastic and genuine. I could see that Tyler's words had resonated with the guests, many of whom were still processing the unusual events of the ceremony and cocktail hour. But as Tyler sat down and the room prepared for the maid of honors, toast, I caught sight of my mother's face. Rather than being moved by Tyler's sincere praise of Marcus's character, she looked even more entrenched in her opposition. It was as if every positive thing said about my husband only strengthened her determination to prove everyone else wrong. Jessica rose for her toast, elegant in her dusty rose bridesmaid dress, her usual vivacious energy somewhat subdued by the evening's events. "I've known Cassie since our freshman year at Northwestern University," she began, "and I can honestly say that I've never seen her as happy as she's been since she met Marcus. Not just happy in a giddy, infatuated way, but happy in a deep, settled, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be way." She went on to tell the story of how I had called her after my first date with Marcus, babbling for 45 minutes about this amazing man who had spent 3 hours talking with me about books and travel and dreams for the future. Cassie told me that night that she had met someone who saw her for exactly who she was, not who her family expected her to be, or who society thought she should be, Jessica continued. And over the past 3 years, I've watched Marcus prove that first impression right over and over again. Jessica's toast was heartfelt and personal, filled with specific examples of Marcus's thoughtfulness and genuine care for my happiness. She spoke about how he had learned to make my favorite tea when I was stressed about my master's thesis, how he had surprised me with a weekend trip to Vancouver when I was feeling overwhelmed by wedding planning, how he had spent hours helping me prepare for job interviews even when his own work was demanding. "What I saw today during the ceremony wasn't just romantic," Jessica said, looking directly at Marcus and me. "It was the actions of someone who understands that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice and it's work, and it's the willingness to be completely vulnerable with another person. Marcus, you've proven that you're worthy of Cassie's love, and Cassie, you found someone who will cherish that love for the rest of your lives." The applause for Jessica's toast was even warmer than it had been for Tyler's, and I felt tears pricking at my eyes again. In contrast to my mother's poison, hearing my closest friends speak about Marcus with such genuine affection and respect felt like a balm to my bruised heart. The dinner courses continued with conversations flowing more easily around the tables. The earlier tension seemed to be dissipating as guests focused on the food, the music, and the celebration at hand. Several people approached our table during the meal to offer personal congratulations, and to comment positively on Marcus's ceremony. Surprise. Mrs. Linda Patterson, my high school English teacher who had remained a family friend, stopped by during the main course. Cassandra, dear, what your husband did today was extraordinary. In 30 years of attending weddings, I've never seen such a thoughtful gesture. You're a lucky woman. Dr. Rachel Kim, a colleague from my work at the nonprofit foundation where I served as a program coordinator, echoed similar sentiments. Marcus, set the bar pretty high for romantic gestures. The rest of us husbands are going to have to step up our game. Each compliment felt like a small victory against my mother's campaign of doubt. It was becoming increasingly clear that the general consensus among our guests was that Marcus had done something admirable and romantic, not suspicious and calculated as Eleanor insisted on portraying it. But my mother wasn't giving up. During the entree service, I noticed her moving from table to table, engaging in hushed conversations with various guests. She was being subtle about it, but I could recognize the body language, the conspiratorial lean-ins, the gestures toward the head table, the serious expressions on the faces of people she spoke with. Marcus noticed it too. She's working the room, he murmured to me as we pretended to focus on our dinner. I see it. I'm sorry, Marcus. This is supposed to be our celebration, and she's turning it into some kind of campaign event. Don't apologize. You can't control her behavior, only your response to it. He squeezed my hand under the table. Besides, I have a feeling her strategy is going to backfire. He was right. As the evening progressed, I began to notice a different dynamic emerging. The guests my mother approached with her theories and concerns were not responding the way she clearly expected. Instead of nodding in agreement or expressing their own doubts, they seemed to be politely but firmly disagreeing with her assessment. I caught fragments of conversations as servers moved around our table. Really think Eleanor is being unfair. A most romantic thing I've seen in years. Lucky to have found someone so devoted. Wish my husband had been half as thoughtful. It became clear that my mother's continued efforts to undermine Marcus were not only failing, but were actually turning people against her. Her inability to accept his gesture of transparency was making her look petty and unreasonable, rather than protective and concerned. The realization seemed to dawn on Eleanor as well. I watched her face grow increasingly frustrated as conversation after conversation failed to produce the validation she was seeking. By the time the dessert course was served, she had retreated to her seat and was sitting in stony silence, her mouth set in the thin line that meant she was truly angry. The wedding cake cutting provided a brief respite from the underlying family drama. Marcus and I posed for photos with the 3-tiered vanilla and raspberry creation that had taken weeks to design, and for a few minutes, we were able to focus purely on each other and the joy of the moment. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked, quietly as we posed for the photographer. "Better than I expected. I think your confrontation in the garden actually helped. People saw her behavior for what it was." I smiled genuinely for the camera while speaking through my teeth. Plus, Tyler and Jessica's toasts reminded everyone why we're actually here. Good. Because I have one more surprise for you, and I want to make sure you're emotionally ready for it. I looked at him sharply. Another surprise? Marcus, you've done enough for one day. He grinned, and I could see mischief sparkling in his green eyes. Trust me on this one. You're going to want to see what's coming next. Before I could press him for details, the band announced that it was time for our first dance. Marcus led me onto the dance floor as they began playing At Last by Etta James, the song we had chosen months ago during one of our many planning sessions. As we swayed together in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the warm glow of candles and the approving smiles of our friends and family, I felt some of the day's stress finally beginning to melt away. This was what mattered. This moment, this man, this commitment we had made to each other. "I love you, Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus whispered in my ear as we danced. "I love you too, Mr. Sullivan. And I'm sorry about my mother. Don't be sorry. What she's doing says everything about her character and nothing about ours. He pulled back slightly to look into my eyes. Besides, I told you I have one more surprise coming. Something that's going to put this whole situation to rest permanently. Before I could ask what he meant, I noticed a commotion near the ballroom entrance. Several guests had turned to look toward the doors, and I could see someone speaking with the maître d'. Marcus noticed my distraction and smiled. Right on schedule, he said with satisfaction. Marcus, what did you do? The person speaking with. The maître d' was a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a navy blue business suit that screamed professional authority. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and courtrooms. Who is that? I asked Marcus as we continued our dance, but his smile only grew wider. That, my darling, wife is Amanda Richardson from Richardson & Associates, the most prestigious private investigation firm on the West Coast. His voice carried a note of satisfaction that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. Marcus, what did you do? I repeated, but this time the question held excitement rather than concern. I told you I hired a private investigator to look into my own background for the financial disclosure. What I didn't mention is that I also asked them to investigate someone else. His eyes found my mother across the dance floor, where Eleanor was watching the newcomer with obvious alarm. Someone who has been making very serious accusations about my character and motives. The implications hit me like lightning. You investigated my mother? I investigated the claims she's been making. There's a difference. Marcus guided me through a gentle turn as the song continued. If someone is going to accuse me of being a gold digger with ulterior motives, I figured it was fair to examine whether that person might be projecting their own history onto our situation. Before I could respond, the music ended, and Amanda Richardson was making her way across the dance floor toward us. The conversations around the ballroom gradually died, down as guests noticed this unexpected addition to the reception. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, Amanda said as she reached us, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who dealt in facts rather than speculation. Congratulations on your marriage. I apologize for interrupting your celebration, but you asked me to deliver this information personally if it proved to be significant. She held out a manila envelope that was considerably thicker than the financial documents Marcus had presented during the ceremony. I believe you'll find the contents quite illuminating. I looked around the ballroom and realized that we had become the center of attention once again. Our guests were watching with the same mixture of curiosity and anticipation they had shown during Marcus's ceremony surprise. But this time, there was an undercurrent of tension as people sensed that something more serious was about to unfold. Perhaps we should, I began, thinking that whatever was in the envelope might be better reviewed privately. No, Marcus said firmly but gently. This needs to be public. Your mother made her accusations publicly, spread her doubts publicly, and tried to undermine our marriage publicly. If there's information that puts those accusations in context, then it should be shared publicly too. Amanda Richardson nodded, approvingly. I concur with your husband, Mrs. Sullivan. Transparency is the enemy of manipulation, and what we've uncovered deserves to be brought into the light. I took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware that every eye in the ballroom was focused on me. The weight of the documents inside felt significant, and I had a sense that whatever I was about to learn would change my understanding of my family in fundamental ways. Would you like me to summarize the findings? Amanda offered. I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've learned that investigative reports can be overwhelming when you're emotionally invested in the subject matter. I looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Amanda. Yes, please. I think a summary would be helpful. Amanda opened her own copy of the file and consulted it briefly. Mrs. Sullivan, your mother hired 3 different private investigators over the past 18 months to investigate your husband's background, financial status, and personal history. The revelation sent a shockwave through the ballroom. Several guests gasped audibly, and I heard my father curse under his breath, something I had never heard him do in public before. She spent over $30,000 on these investigations, Amanda continued, all funded through a secret bank account that your father apparently knew nothing about. The investigators found nothing incriminating about Mr. Sullivan, but Mrs. Whitman continued to demand more invasive searches. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother hadn't just been expressing maternal concern. She had been conducting a systematic campaign to find dirt on Marcus, spending enormous amounts of money in the process. But that's not the most significant finding, Amanda said, turning a page in her file. In the process of investigating your mother's financial records to understand how she was funding these investigations, we discovered some interesting discrepancies in her own background. Eleanor had gone completely pale and was gripping the edge of her table so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She looked like someone watching a building collapse around them. Mrs. Whitman has been presenting herself as coming from a family of modest but respectable means in Mississippi. However, public records tell a different story. Amanda's voice remained professionally neutral, but there was an undertone of satisfaction that suggested she enjoyed exposing hypocrisy. She was actually born Eleanor May Stockton in a town called Poverty Point, Louisiana, to parents who were both in and out of jail for various petty crimes throughout her childhood. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system and the distant clatter of dishes being cleared in the kitchen, but not a single guest was speaking. More relevantly, Amanda continued, when Eleanor was 22 years old, she targeted and married a wealthy businessman named Harold Whitman, your father, Mrs. Sullivan, specifically for his money and social connections. We found letters. She wrote to a friend describing her plan to land a rich husband and never have to worry about money again. I felt like the floor was falling away beneath my feet. My parents' entire love story, everything I had believed about their relationship, and my own family history was apparently built on lies. Eleanor also had a previous marriage that she has never disclosed to your father, Amanda said, delivering what felt like the final blow. She was married to a man named Darrell Thompson in Louisiana when she was 19. The marriage lasted less than a year, ending when she abandoned him and disappeared with several $1,000s she had stolen from his business account. The manila envelope fell from my hands, scattering photographs and documents across the dance floor. I stared at Amanda Richardson, then at my mother, then at my father, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. My father looked as shocked as I felt. His face had gone through several color changes during Amanda's presentation, finally settling on a gray pallor that made him look older than his 62 years. It was clear that he was learning this information for the first time along with everyone else. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is this true?" For a moment, I thought my mother might continue her pattern of denial and deflection. She looked around the ballroom at the faces of friends, family members, and social acquaintances who had just learned that her entire persona was a carefully constructed lie. But then something seemed to break inside her. The mask of refined respectability that she had worn for over 30 years finally cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice rising to a pitch I had never heard from her before. "I grew up with nothing, William. Nothing. Do you have any idea what it's like to be hungry, to wear the same clothes for weeks because they're the only ones you have, to watch your mother turn tricks just to pay rent on a trailer that should have been condemned?" The confession sent another shockwave through the ballroom. Several of the older guests, my father's colleagues and their wives, looked like they were witnessing a car accident in slow motion. "I swore I would never live like that again," Eleanor continued, her composure completely shattered now. "When I met you, William, you were successful, established, everything I needed to build a different life. Yes, I targeted you. Yes, I planned it. But I have been a good wife to you for 30 years. My father stood up slowly from his seat, his face cycling through emotions I had never seen him display. A good wife doesn't lie about her entire past, Eleanor. A good wife doesn't steal money to hire investigators to spy on her daughter's boyfriend. A good wife doesn't try to destroy her daughter's happiness because she's projecting her own guilt onto someone else. The confrontation was playing out in front of 200 wedding guests, but I found myself unable to move or speak. The woman I had known as my mother my entire life was apparently a complete fiction, and the real Eleanor was someone whose desperation and selfishness had driven her to build a life based on lies. Marcus never asked Cassandra for money, my father continued, his lawyer training taking over as he processed the implications of Amanda's report. He never showed any interest in her trust fund or her inheritance. You created a scenario in your head based on your own history, and then you spent our money trying to prove that fiction was reality. Eleanor's face contorted with rage and desperation. You think he's different, but he's not. They're all the same, William. Men see what they can get from us, and they take it. The only difference is that Marcus is better at hiding it than most. No, Amanda Richardson interjected, consulting her file again. Mr. Sullivan actually declined several opportunities to benefit financially from his relationship with your daughter. He refused her offer to invest in his business, insisted on paying for his own engagement ring rather than allowing her to help, and has never accessed any of her family accounts despite having legal authorization to do so after they became engaged. She pulled out another document. In fact, our investigation revealed that Mr. Sullivan has been secretly setting aside money for the past 2 years specifically to ensure that he could support a family without any financial assistance from the Whitman family assets. Marcus looked embarrassed by this revelation. I wanted to be sure I could take care of you on my own, he said quietly to me. I never wanted there to be any question about my motives. The contrast between Marcus's actual behavior and my mother's projection of her own history onto him was stark and devastating. Eleanor had spent $30,000 trying to prove that my husband was the gold digger that she herself had been, only to discover evidence that he was the exact opposite. Mrs. Whitman, Amanda said, addressing my mother directly for the first time. Your accusations against Mr. Sullivan were not based on evidence or observation. They were based on your own guilt about how you entered your marriage. You assumed he was using the same tactics you used because you couldn't conceive of someone genuinely loving your daughter for herself. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair as if the air had been let out of her. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind someone who looked smaller and older than the woman who had tried to poison my wedding day with her suspicions. I was protecting her, she said weakly, but the words rang hollow now that everyone knew the truth about her motivations. No, I said, finding my voice at last. You were protecting yourself. You were protecting the lie you've been living for 30 years, and you were willing to destroy my happiness to do it. The ballroom remained silent as guests absorbed the full implications of what had just been revealed. My wedding reception had turned into a courtroom drama, with my mother's character and credibility completely demolished by the very type of investigation she had tried to use against my husband. But as devastating as the truth was, I felt a strange sense of relief washing over me. For months, my mother's constant criticism and suspicion had made me question my own judgment, had planted seeds of doubt about the man I loved. Now I understood that her attacks on Marcus had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with her own unresolved guilt about the foundation of her own marriage. Marcus moved closer to me and wrapped his arm around my waist, a gesture of support and solidarity that felt like an anchor in the emotional storm that was raging around us. I'm sorry you had to learn about this on our wedding day, he said quietly, but I couldn't let her continue to poison our marriage with lies based on her own history. I looked around the ballroom at our guests, who were still processing the dramatic revelations of the evening. Some looked shocked, others sympathetic, and a few appeared to be struggling with how to react to such an unprecedented breach of wedding reception etiquette. But as I surveyed the faces of people we had invited to celebrate the beginning of our life together, I realized that something had shifted fundamentally. The doubt and suspicion that my mother had tried to cast over our relationship had been not just disproven, but completely reversed. Everyone in that room now understood exactly who Marcus Sullivan was, and exactly who Eleanor Whitman was not. The Tao. Aftermath of Amanda Richardson's revelations created a strange, suspended moment in the ballroom. 200 wedding guests sat in stunned silence, processing the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about the Whitman family dynamics. My father was the first to break the silence. He stood up from his seat with the deliberate movements of a man who had just watched his entire world shift on its axis, walked slowly across the dance floor, and stopped directly in front of my mother's chair. 31 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. 31 years of marriage, Eleanor, and I never knew who I was actually married to. Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that were red-rimmed but defiant. Even in defeat, even with her lies exposed to a room full of witnesses, she seemed unwilling to show genuine remorse. "You got what you wanted out of our arrangement, William," she replied, her voice hoarse from the emotional outburst. "A beautiful home, a respectable wife, a daughter to carry on your family name? Don't pretend you didn't benefit from my reinvention." The coldness in her words made several guests visibly recoil. Mrs. Henderson, my father's law partner's wife, actually put her hand to her chest, as if Eleanor's casual dismissal of their decades-long marriage had physically struck her. I thought. "I had fallen in love," my father said quietly. "I thought I had found a partner, someone who chose me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Apparently, I was wrong about that too." He turned away from Eleanor and walked toward Marcus and me, his expression cycling through grief, anger, and something that looked like apology. "Marcus, Cassandra," he said when he reached us. "I owe you both an enormous apology. I should have seen what was happening, should have recognized that Eleanor's behavior was coming from a place of guilt rather than genuine concern." "Dad, you couldn't have known," I said, reaching out to touch his arm. "She fooled all of us." "No, she didn't fool you. You saw through her accusations and chose to trust your own judgment about Marcus's character." He extended his hand to Marcus. "Son, I hope you can forgive an old fool who should have defended you from the beginning." Marcus shook my father's hand firmly. "Judge Whitman, there's nothing to forgive. Eleanor is very skilled at manipulation. She had 30 years of practice." Amanda Richardson interrupted with more devastating details. "Eleanor's secret bank account, the one she used to fund the investigations into Mr. Sullivan, has been active for the past 5 years. She's been systematically moving money from the family accounts into this personal account, totaling approximately $250,000. My father's face went white. $250,000? Eleanor has also been in contact with a divorce attorney for the past 8 months, seeking advice about asset protection and alimony calculations. The revelations painted a picture of someone who had been methodically planning to destroy not just my marriage, but her own as well." Eleanor finally stood up from her chair, her movements unsteady. "I think I've heard quite enough. I'm going. Home, to pack." "Eleanor, we need to discuss this." "There's nothing to discuss, William." She turned to face him fully. "You know who I really am now. You know what I did, why I did it, and what I was planning to do. The question is whether you can live with that knowledge or whether you'll be filing divorce papers yourself." My father looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know. I honestly don't know if I can get past this level of deception. The lies. About your background, maybe I could understand. But the investigations, the stolen money, the divorce planning, Eleanor, you've been systematically betraying our family for years." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "Then you have your answer," She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Marcus and me. For a moment, I thought she might offer an apology or express some regret. Instead, she said, "I still think you're making a mistake, Cassandra. Time will tell whether I'm right or wrong about Marcus. But at least now you can't say you weren't warned." The sheer audacity of her parting shot left everyone speechless. Even after having her own deceptions exposed, she was still trying to plant seeds of doubt about my husband's character. "Goodbye, Eleanor," Marcus said firmly. "I hope you find whatever it is you've been looking for all these years." She left without another word, walking out of the ballroom with the same calculated precision that had apparently guided all of her major life decisions. After Amanda Richardson departed, Marcus and I stood together in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by guests who were staring at us with expressions ranging from sympathy to shock. The reception was clearly over, but nobody seemed to know how to end it. My father took charge of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that this evening has taken some unexpected turns. Marcus and Cassandra, this is your day, and you shouldn't have to spend it dealing with family drama that isn't of your making." He gestured toward the band. "I think some music and dancing might help us all remember why we're actually here, to celebrate the marriage of two people who clearly love each other very much." The music seemed to break the spell, and gradually, conversations began to resume. But the guests who approached us were no longer offering generic wedding congratulations. Instead, they wanted to express their support and admiration for how we had handled the situation. Mrs. Patricia Henning came to our table. "Cassandra, dear, your husband conducted himself with remarkable grace tonight. What he did during the ceremony was romantic, and what he did tonight was necessary. Your mother's behavior revealed a great deal about her character." Dr. Rodriguez offered similar sentiments. "Marcus, I've learned to recognize manipulation when I see it. What your mother-in-law was doing had nothing to do with protecting her daughter. You handled it perfectly." The stream of supportive comments continued throughout the rest of the evening. Rather than damaging our reputation, the evening's revelations had actually strengthened people's perception of Marcus's character and integrity. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, they offered congratulations that felt different from typical wedding wishes. People weren't just celebrating our marriage. They were celebrating our survival of a test that most couples never have to face. Tyler, Marcus's best man, summed it up perfectly. In retrospect, this was probably the best thing that could have happened. Most couples spend years dealing with doubts and external criticism. You guys got it all out of the way in one evening. As we finally left our wedding reception and headed to our honeymoon suite, I realized that we were beginning our marriage with something most couples never achieve: absolute certainty about each other's character and motivations. The woman who had tried to destroy our happiness had inadvertently strengthened it by forcing us to prove what we already knew: that our love was real, our commitment was genuine, and our foundation was strong enough to withstand any storm. "So," Marcus said as he carried me across the threshold, "how do you feel about being married to a man who had to hire a private investigator to prove he wasn't a gold digger?" I laughed. "I feel like I married someone who was willing to expose his mother-in-law's deepest secrets to protect our marriage. That's either incredibly romantic or slightly terrifying." "Both?" he suggested with a grin. "Definitely both, but mostly romantic. Eleanor Whitman had said, 'He'll leave you soon,' and tried to prove her prediction through lies and manipulation. Instead, she had proven exactly the opposite: that Marcus Sullivan was a man worth keeping, and that our love was strong enough to survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it." 6 months after our dramatic wedding, Marcus and I were thriving in our mountain home. TechFlow Solutions had exploded beyond expectations. Marcus's transparency gesture attracted major investors impressed by our partnership approach. Within months, we'd secured massive contracts and expanded our team. But true success wasn't measured in revenue. It was waking up beside someone whose character had been publicly tested and emerged unbreakable. My parents' divorce had been swift and brutal. Eleanor treated the dissolution like a business transaction, hiring aggressive attorneys to maximize her settlement. She received substantial alimony and a lump sum, but in exchange signed a no-contact clause my father insisted upon. No future communication with Marcus and me. Strange, I told Marcus one morning on our porch. Cutting my mother out should feel more significant, but mostly it just feels peaceful. You already did the emotional work, he replied from his laptop. The wedding confrontation forced you to choose between her reality and your judgment. Legal separation was just paperwork. Then my father called with unexpected news. Eleanor contacted my attorney. She wants to see you. Claims she's been in therapy and wants to apologize. The request sent chills through me. 6 months of peace, and now this. What do you think? I asked, putting him on speaker. Honestly, I don't know. 6 months ago, I'd say Eleanor was incapable of self-reflection, but maybe therapy is legitimate. After hanging up, Marcus asked what I was thinking. 6 months ago, seeing her would have terrified me. Now, I'm curious. I want to test how strong I've become. 2 days later, I met Eleanor at the Marriott lobby. She looked dramatically different, older, more fragile, somehow more real than the polished woman who'd tried destroying my wedding. Thank you for seeing me, she said, sitting down carefully. I've been in therapy since the divorce, she continued. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my wedding behavior wasn't about protecting you. It was about protecting myself from confronting my own choices 30 years ago. She pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was my grandmother's silver locket, the one meant for me when I married. Your grandmother gave this to you when you were born, said it was for your wedding? But I never gave it because I was jealous you chose her dress over mine, jealous of your connection to his family. The locket held 2 photos, my grandmother as a young woman and me as a baby. She would have wanted Marcus, Eleanor said quietly. She would have seen what I refused to see, that he loves you the way she loved your grandfather. After Eleanor left, I sat alone, processing this unexpected closure. At home, Marcus waited with coffee and concern. I shared everything, her apology, her acknowledgement, her recognition of his genuine love. So she finally understands, he said. That's good for her. Carrying that guilt must have been exhausting. I looked at the locket in my hands, then at my husband. The woman who had predicted he'll leave you soon had finally admitted the truth, that Marcus had won the only prize that mattered, genuine, lasting love. Our story had come full circle, from Eleanor's venomous prophecy to her ultimate acknowledgement that some gifts truly can change everything. The transparency Marcus offered on our wedding day hadn't just silenced my mother's doubts. It had built a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. Eleanor Whitman's prediction had been wrong. Marcus Sullivan wasn't leaving. He was staying forever. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.